Welcome to Roundtail Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy in the ordinary, look for motes of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about when we talk about faith. Hey, Ed.
Leslie, how's it going?
I'm good. If I occasionally whisper, it's because we are recording from our respective home offices, and I'm about 3 doors down from my toddler, who I just put to bed. So I will occasionally remember that she is trying to sleep. But
We're listening in.
Yes. The good news is when she was very, very little, we would purposely be very loud.
Good for you.
When we put her to bed. So once she falls asleep, it should be okay. So we can be our usual humor-filled selves.
Rowdy selves.
There you go. Exactly. So we're on some week. Hold on. 16.
16. Mm-hmm.
16. And we are in the Gospel of Luke. I will admit there's a part of me that's like, phew. Not another John one, because I need a little break from John after last week.
Yeah, that was intense.
So we have Luke 10:25 through 37. So here we go. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted Jesus, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave him to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus, Go, and do thou likewise. Some stellar KJV action happening there.
Yes, King James Version. Not everybody's favorite.
Do thou likewise.
Yes.
As a Shakespeare enthusiast, I'm very happy over here, so it's fine.
Good. Good.
Starter question. What is the importance in this story of pointing out that the guy that had mercy on him was a Samaritan?
Great question.
Thanks.
Great question. Yep. We can be pretty sure that when Jesus told this story and used the word Samaritan, eyebrows would have been raised. There would have been sharp intakes of breath. So in the history of Israel, you actually have a history of 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And these kingdoms, they were actually one until there was a divided monarchy hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Mm-hmm. But over that period of time, some animosity lingered over those divisions. So, when Rome came in and basically made it all part of the empire, that didn't reduce or eliminate the divisions that people felt, let's say between the northerners and the southerners. Okay. And so Jerusalem in the south, Samaria in the north, and Samaritans were still affiliated with some of the religious traditions that had developed in the northern kingdom. Okay. And that meant that they had a different sense of holy places, perhaps some holy traditions that were not lined up with those in the southern part. So animosity developed over the years. You don't see the things the way we do. We don't share the same sacred code, the same sacred text, not even the same sacred places. And I think the northern kingdom especially had been associated over the centuries with worship of other deities. And this is certainly many, many years before Jesus, where the prophet Elijah, was doing his work and resisting the incursion of foreigners and their gods, right? So someone in Jesus' audience hearing this story about a Samaritan, again, with all of that difference implied by years and years of division, would have been rather shocked to hear Jesus describe a good Samaritan. And by the way, the word good is a word that we've applied to the story, right? So the key here is that it's interesting because he says a certain Samaritan.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
As he journeyed, came where he was and when he saw him. And it's the fact that what he does is so obviously good. I think that's what shocks people. It's not a name or a label that Jesus applies to him. It's a description of his action. And that's what gives the parable its spice.
So it's almost like I'm picturing sort of in contemporary terms, thinking of it like the troubles of Northern and Southern Ireland is kind of what my brain made a comparison there of the sort of Catholic Protestant kind of same religion, but much very different ideologies and theologies.
Yes. Wherever you have stark division, you have a ripe opportunity to retell the story of the Good Samaritan. Would it work perfectly well with the political context in the United States right now, where it would be very easy to devise a story that pictured a good someone on the other side. You can fill in the blank of the religious affiliation. But actually, when you mentioned Northern Ireland, that certainly, I remember I was living in Scotland, in some ways during some of the worst years of the Troubles. And there were actually artists who went out of their way to show Jesus standing next to someone, with a scarf from a football team, from one, a Protestant supported team or a Roman Catholic supported team. And of course, trying to show Jesus, being open to people who would not have been considered worthy of companionship of Jesus. So
that's so interesting because I feel like before I had understanding of what Samaritan was in the historical context of this story, I think I'd always assumed like, oh, Good Samaritan, like good and Samaritan is like kind of the same thing, because Good Samaritan has become such like a phrase in the lexicon of, modern culture.
Yeah.
And so I think I had never been thought of it like, oh, that to the audience listening to this story, that would have felt like, what's the word? An oxymoron.
Yes.
To them, to their perspective
Completely.
Of how they're hearing it.
Exactly.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. Yep. Contradiction in terms.
So, and it's interesting too that he points out that the first person to walk by this poor wounded man is a priest.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that's great about this story, is that the kicker here is that you get supposedly the religious insiders who are completely conversant with the law, right? They should be able to understand this in a second, and they are not the ones who demonstrate the goodness. So you've got the priest, you've got the Levite who comes from the tribe of Levi, which historically conducted priestly functions for the people. So here's someone who's very conversant with the law and it's all of these rich religious traditions and rituals, yet neither of these individuals connects at all with the person who's in the ditch.
Right.
And that's the staggering thing, about this, that the people you expect to be great aren't even good, and they're not even close to good. They can't wait to rush on by and leave this person behind them.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I also was, struck by the fact that we're seeing again in our 52 for the journey, the thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That we're seeing this repeated again,
Almost like we
Back-
planned it.
That's almost, maybe. But I love that it's being repeated like back to Jesus.
Right? Yeah.
You know, it's like, what have you been taught? What have I been telling you?
Yes.
Have you been listening?
Right?
I love that. It's like classic teacher.
Yeah. And the lawyer he's doing really well on the quiz for the most part. You know, he gets it. He answers correctly. But you sort of feel like you can hear the ice cracking, you know, the further along this story we go, like something's going to happen here. Something's not going to work out. And when he comes to this part, you know, where he struggles a little bit around the whole vision of neighbor. And so that's what prompts the story. But again, somebody who you think is an insider, who's been raised in the tradition. I think this is a really interesting story in many respects, but there's one thing that actually occurs to me now, and that is that in the last few decades, there's been all kinds of literature written about shaping people in the church, and that's the phrase that gets used, you know, shaping people's faith formation, right? These are people who have aced the faith formation exams. They got the stories. They can quote scripture, but when confronted with an instance of a story that demonstrates this, extraordinary goodness, they're kind of on the outside of things.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to me that, well, first of all, it makes me really use those phrases. I want to use those phrases very carefully, because just because people grow up in a religious tradition and hear the stories and hear the laws and can quote them and on and on and on, what's missing? Something's missing at some point. In fact, one thing that really stands out for me, you know, is behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted Jesus. So, I mean, there's something off right from the very beginning.
Right.
Right? I mean, he knows. Jesus turns around and asks him a question, and he basically gets the question correct. But he tempts Jesus. That's not a good way to start the relationship.
Yeah.
And then even when Jesus says, do this and you shall live, and you think, okay, well, that's the end of that. He knows what to do. But he says, but he willing to justify himself.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Said unto Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Right? So it's like it's like the whole story is about him.
Right.
Right? And he has to make sure that he's checked all the proper boxes. He's gotten all the answers correct. And he's off kilter from the beginning. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's not, yeah. He's like, it's hard to tell. It's like, is he trying to appear knowledgeable or appear righteous, or kind of what is he trying to do there is really interesting.
It's the difference between a question that's being asked that's a genuine search for knowledge, right? And the other kind of question, which is just like, I'm gonna.
Yeah. I'm laughing so hard because there was this class we had in grad school on Wednesdays called Colloquium. And there were these wonderful presenters every week that would come and talk and give really in-depth, thoughtful presentations. And there was always a Q&A time at the end. And it was always quite a scene.
Yeah.
Because it was sort of like, the questions were like 90%, let me show you how much I know about this thing you just presented about.
Right, because otherwise how will you know how smart I am?
How will you know my expertise in your area?
Right.
And then like a 10%, like here's a lowball question that just justifies the monologue I just gave.
Yep.
And it like if it was once or twice, it would have been funny, but it was every week.
Yeah.
And so my best friend Matt and I, my best friend Matt and I would just sit next to each other and just be like, do, 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 do. We never, I don't think either of us asked a single question the entire time. We're like, no, We're not diving in. The water's too deep there, my friend.
Oh,
No, thank you.
yeah.
Which
This
is
is
to
one of
say
these moments.
This is that. Yeah, this is like a let me show you.
Mm-hmm.
So you know who I am.
Right. Right.
Jesus. I'm interested. I feel like in the stories we've been reading, especially recently, the stories of like people challenging Jesus and being like, well, I'm going to catch you in knowing something, or I'm going to challenge you in this. And there was that other story a few weeks ago of like, oh, he answered well. And I was like, well, it's Jesus. So yeah. Good.
Yep. Well, I think I love your point here that Jesus has to field a lot of questions.
They're not always like genuine questions.
No, they're not always coming from a place of, how can you help me? But sometimes from a position of, I need to use this question to show you who I am in relationship to you. I'm a lot more interested in who I am, Jesus, than in who you are. So just wait for this amazing question that I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to use that time to demonstrate my knowledge. But again, it shows this range that he has to deal with. And I think that's really a part of his life that we may not recognize all that often. He's always being tested in a sense, sometimes by dramatic and real human need, and sometimes by the need of the human ego to assert itself, and maybe sometimes by someone who wants to deflect attention off of themselves and point to some other issue or some other person or whatever it might be. So I just think that it's a good thing to recognize about him that this is such an important part of his life. And he's also a questioner himself, obviously. He asks more questions than he provides answers, by far. Yeah. But this is one of these cases where he has a kind of a challenging encounter with this person. I mean, not necessarily challenging to him, but it's just fascinating the way that he works with this.
I think there's something wonderful about it in the sense of like, if Jesus, the literal child of God, son of God, is having to deal with this, that
yes.
Like, we in our non-divinity,
right, yeah.
When we are challenged, it's like, okay, well, even Jesus had to deal with this, so it's fine.
Right.
You know, it gives me a little more patience, maybe.
In Christian theology, there is this wonderful word called, incarnation, right? It's the idea of God becoming flesh, the word of God becoming flesh. And here's what happens when it sounds so mystifying and majestic, right? And beyond comprehension. But in the end, part of what it means is you get to field questions from somebody who's got a weak ego and is trying to figure out how great they are. So it's you really, there's a translation in the Gospel of John. It says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And I had a professor in seminary who translated that, as God moved into the neighborhood, and.
That.
Isn't that beautiful?
That's
and so when Jesus is walking around he moved into the neighborhood. He's walking through the neighborhood, and therefore he takes everything that comes to him. And that's I think that's part of what's spectacular about it, is this receptivity that he provides. And he winds up telling a story from this, which, as you pointed out, there are a handful of stories. There's a handful of stories from the New Testament that have made it into pop culture. And this is one of them. So that in our culture, someone can say, "Boy, I heard this story about this amazing Good Samaritan the other day." Now, we don't, as you also mentioned earlier, we may not, we don't quite get the story right because we automatically assume the Good Samaritan was just an amazing person.
Right.
But what really makes the story of the Good Samaritan special is a person who was amazing, not just because of what they did, but because no one really thought that person was capable of goodness. And if we restricted the use of the term Good Samaritan in that way, we'd be telling different stories. We'd be going out of our way, probably, to find stories about people whose views do not agree with our own, and saying, I hate to tell you the story, but I found this amazing example of someone who, up until this point, I didn't really respect, but look at what they did.
Yeah.
And that I think is how love for enemies gets put into action. Because now you have to think outside the box, and you have to go find a story about whoever that Samaritan is that shows their goodness. And when you're doing, when you're spending time looking for the researching goodness in the lives of people whose views don't line up with your own, that is designed to weaken that muscle of prejudice so that it strengthens instead the muscle of inclusion. I think that's what Jesus is up to here.
That's wonderful. It makes me think of two things. First of all, the Mr. Rogers, find the helpers quote that we quoted, I think a few months ago on here.
I love that you shared that. Yes.
And it's this idea of just, when things are tough, there's going to be people helping. So look for those stories, and those stories can help you find the shared humanity in whatever is going on. And then I really think in the last line of this selection, then Jesus said unto him, go and do.
Right.
Which I think is where you were leading with your last comment, which is it's an action, it's a challenge. It's not go and be, go and live. No, go do that.
Right.
He's not mincing words. He's not being overly poetic. He's like, go.
Yep.
Do that.
Copy it.
Yeah. Copy,
Yeah.
paste. Again. Rinse, repeat.
Yep. Yeah, I love it because, the end of it, go and do thou likewise, echoes the comment that Jesus has made to him earlier. And he said unto him, thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. So when you're doing this, in other words, stop worrying about anything else. Heaven will take care of itself. Because the thing that prompts this, in a way, right, is this question, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? That's what's on his mind.
How do I get into heaven? How do I get my reward, right?
And actually, I think it was something I read by Martin Luther King about this passage that actually indicated that, Jesus does not say, you shouldn't be thinking that way. He lets that question stand, which I think is very interesting. Yeah. And as if to say, well, look, I'm going to take that worry off your plate because there's an answer to that. And Jesus' approach is basically, you know the answer, so you tell me. And he does know the answer, but he doesn't quite push it far enough into the doing category. This is, as you pointed out, it's not a knowing thing. It's a knowing thing to a degree, but it has to also be a doing thing.
Right.
And so that's where it winds up. And so if you're going to copy anybody, copy this person. And I think that it's especially interesting to read this story and important to read this story right now because we hear a lot about the word great in our culture right now, the way the word great is often used. I think, and there's a beautiful book, by the way, I think the author's name is Jim Collins. He wrote it some years ago called From Good to Great, which is basically a business book, helping businesses to say, okay, what we're doing now is pretty good. What could we do that's great? Jesus does get some questions from his disciples about who's the greatest in the kingdom of God. And he tells them basically he has a way for them to respond to that. But the key thing here is it's not the great Samaritan. It's the Good Samaritan. And goodness is enough here. It's being good. He doesn't have to draw. I think in some ways the lawyer wants to be great. Jesus says, you know what? Just be good. That'll do the trick.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that that's what's really applauded in this story is human goodness. And I think if there is one thing that we have really allowed to slip between our fingers, it's the magic of human goodness and how that satisfies us, can satisfy us. We're eating the wrong menu. We're eating foods that are making us mean. And here's a story that's designed to satisfy that deeper, deeper hunger, which is really, how can I do something in this world that's going to feel satisfying? And these things are within the reach of everybody. It's within the reach of everyone to do something good. Maybe not to this level of the Samaritan, who not only takes care of this person, but basically brings him to an inn, takes care of his health care bill, sort of long-term health care. It's a remarkable story about his investment in that person who was wounded and left for dead. But these are the stories that we need right now. We need to keep these interpretations right in front of us, because they will satisfy us. I'm sure of that.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I love that you've brought that up in that specific way, because I was just thinking about how, what is written in the law, what are they saying, and the lawyer responds, "Oh, love the Lord thy God, love your neighbor as yourself," and Jesus says, "Yeah, love is an action. To be good is doing good, is the action of love, and that to be good you do good." And I think it's I feel like there's everyone, I want to say most people consider themselves a good person. But I think it's also important to challenge ourselves and say, okay, well, if I feel that way about myself, maybe my thoughts are good, my intentions are good, am I doing? Am I acting out goodness? Am my actions reflecting that person I feel like I am on the inside?
Yes.
Which I think is an important maybe challenge to each of us to really look at and be like, am I doing all that I think I could for my neighbor, however we define neighbor today or tomorrow or next week?
I think that if we were to look at this, at the actions, if we were to break down the actions of the Samaritan, everything from noticing, first of all, noticing the suffering person, not turning his back on the suffering person, taking personal responsibility for the suffering person, making sure that there was lengthening the care of the person, right? So he just doesn't pour oil and wine on the wounds and then say, gee, I hope it all works out for you. He actually puts him on, his animal. And in fact, I love it when he says here, he set him on his own beast. And I think if I was ever going to write a story about this, it would be the Good Samaritan rides again, whatever his beast is, right? But again, he puts his transportation system at the disposal of the wounded person. He puts his personal financial resources at his disposal and says, you take care of him, innkeeper, and I'll be back to check in on him. If we break all those actions down and then say, that's what adds up to goodness, I think we've got a very clear picture in front of us. And then we can all evaluate and say, what would it be like? What opportunity do I have to demonstrate at least some part of that? Maybe not all those pieces, right? But some part of that. And then to see where the Spirit will take us, as we go down the road. I think that gives us a vision that we need of what it means to be good in the way that Jesus is describing that. And so.
I love that. I have to say, it made me think of, there's a parenting thing going around, which is about noticing. And I think that's what you were talking about noticing is such a crucial, it's a skill.
Yes.
And so there's been this thing now of parents encouraging their kids, take 15 minutes, look around your room or look around the house and notice what you can tidy up, organize, clean, pick up after yourself, so that they're helping their child develop the skills to see what needs to be done down the road. Because I will say, on the flip side of that, I'm very good at not noticing.
We can all be selective.
Yeah, I'm really good at it. To the point where my poor spouse, he looks at me like, how does that? I'm like, I genuinely didn't even see it. I genuinely just, nope, wasn't even there. But thank you for pointing it out, and I'm happy to help you, but I didn't even notice it. So as a personal anecdote, noticing is the first step here.
It is
that
the
some
first.
of us miss. So
Yes.
I'm going to try this week to be better at noticing. That's my challenge for myself.
Yes, I think that's excellent. You know, it's interesting because in a sense, they all noticed, right? These three people who go by, they all started, which I think is also a good point in and of itself. They all started from about the same place, but then they quickly made a departure from it. And so it's lengthening the notice, you know, it's stretching it out to say, okay, what's going on here? And there's something that happens to us when we not only notice, but then respond. And, you know, it can feel, hey, let's be honest, it can then feel like we're way out of our comfort zone. It can feel uncomfortable, maybe risky even. And I remember this is quite a long time ago, and I was serving in an urban setting, and I was working late, and there was a knock on the church door, and this was in the middle of winter. And not someone knocking on the door late was not happening often, but I went to answer it, and it was a gentleman who was looking for shelter. And so I called the local shelter, and there's a part of me, I can still remember this, thinking in the back of my mind, what are you doing? You know, you're alone in this building, you're alone with this man, you don't know him, and he doesn't know you. So it's kind of, we're all strangers here. Yeah. And I called up this one shelter, and interestingly enough, the man at the shelter said, oh yes, I know him, and I said, okay, I'm bringing him down to you. But it was a moment for a while there where I thought, I feel like I'm out of my depth here. And but we got ourselves in the car and had a great conversation on the way down. And but still, I recall that when you cross over from noticing to actually getting into the car, there's a time there where you're on very uncertain, terms, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah.
And I think there's some courage there. There's risk.
Yeah. Well, and I think he's probably got in his mind, can I trust this person?
Sure.
Can I really trust him? And I'm thinking, are we going to all be okay? But it's part of what happens in almost any setting, I think, when we reach out, when we're vulnerable, or when we're reaching out and responding to someone who is vulnerable and thinking, how do we think this is going to go? And so, the Samaritan crosses that gap. And thank God.
Well, thank you, Ed, for this really great conversation. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.